The First World War. The First World War introduced many new technologies in this battleground and improved many others. But the incompetence of the high commanders brought about the final massacre. The machine gun was probably the most deadly destruction weapon. Complete lines of infantry suffered its firepower, turning to easy-to-hit targets. Artillery was commissioned with a crucial role. Its aim was to weaken the enemy's lines before the assault of the troops. But too frequently the barrage shellings were not properly coordinated with the marching infantry, and they just did the work of warning the enemy of the impending attack. In the Western Front, the troops on both sides had been on the watch for months. In the attrition war of the trenches, which were just some no man's land yards away from the enemies, there were no chances for movements. Any design to break through would cost thousands of lives and would only lead to a counterattack, getting the situation back where it started. Life in the trenches in the First World War took many shapes and could be fairly different from one sector to another. For the soldiers, this was something fully unexpected. Death was a persistent companion to those posted in the front line, even without any attack to perform or to repel. In some sectors, it was a fact of everyday life to stay under enemy's fire, bringing about death at random, whether the victims were under the cover of the trenches or not. Many other soldiers were buried alive as a result of artillery's barrages. Generally, the newly arrived to the trenches were warned that death threatened them in the shape of a sniper's bullet. It was reckoned that 1/3 of the Allied losses in the Western Front occurred in the trenches. On the other hand, rats and flies became the greatest hosts for infections, for it was impossible to keep food away from them. Dirty and worn-out uniforms increased the soldiers' discomfort. Politicians required the military a strategic solution that could break the front routine and drive them to a final victory. Meanwhile, the toll in lives increased. In the Eastern Front, the Russian troops held the pressure of the German, Turkish, and Austro-Hungarian troops. This war between great powers and their use of new weapons such as gas, flamethrowers, and tanks raised the horror of the struggle to a level never seen before. Year 1915. Globalization of the conflict. (1915) was the first full year of the Great War. The conundrum for both sides was to know where would the war be won? In what front? Troops' movements, so specific to the war's first weeks in 1914, were at a dead halt, and the fight was focused on the trenches. In Western Europe, the Germans had built very well-arrayed positions, often established in strategic high ground. This meant for the French and their British allies a difficult prospect if they wanted to storm these positions to defeat the Germans and then send massive troop reinforcements to support the Russians in the Eastern Front. On January the 19th and 20th, 1915, the Germans launched their first air raids against the east of England, killing 20 civilians. Both sides understood that the conflict was scaling up a new dimension with the L-3 and L-4 Zeppelin aircraft raids on the English towns. On December the 16th, 1914, a German squadron of the High Sea Fleet, under Franz von Hipper, shelled the British harbors of Scarborough, Whitby, and Hartlepool on the east of the island. The raid lasted more than 1 hour, leaving 137 dead civilians and almost 600 wounded. Hipper was bestowed the infamous honor of being called the baby's killer. On January the 23rd, 1915, the aggressive German admiral ships, backed with air support, attacked the British fishing fleet harbors. The British people felt revolted, not only because the Royal Navy had failed to prevent these raids, but also because the German admiral and his ships could break free thanks to the lack of coordination among the Navy commanders. The celebrated Admiral Beatty was required to put a check on the German actions. Elated by their success, the German ships under Hipper were planning another assault. But the British picked up again the German radio transmissions. Beatty sailed with 5 battle cruisers and 6 light cruisers to clash with Hipper's ships. More cruisers and destroyers joined him off Harwich, and he set course to find Hipper's ships at 7:20 a.m. of January the 24th, 1915. When he realized the British advantage, the startled Hipper tried to run away, thinking the British battle cruisers relatively slow. They were, on the contrary, remarkably faster than the Germans, and they succeeded in catching up with them in the Dogger Bank in the central North Sea. The battle was quickly engaged. A great British success was being expected until Beatty's flagship, the Lion, was seriously damaged, and he had to move his flag to the Princess Royal. The British naval procedures were low and equivocal, and their firepower was an absolute failure. They made 75 hits out of more than 1,000 shots. The German Admiral Hipper was able to break free, but at least the Battle of Dogger Bank put a temporary end to the raids on the English coast. On the 1st of February 1915, the German government gave a final push to the U-boats campaign, boosting the naval war without limits. The U-20 sank 2 British ships in the Channel. Aiming at the English supply lines, the German ships tried to block their harbors, and since February the 18th, assumed as a legitimate target any ship sailing for the United Kingdom from any country, belligerent or not. There was also an expansion of the air raids on the island against fuel deposits, military bases, and shipyards. Too much earnestness in the submarine war led to assaults on neutral ships, including American ships. These assaults were carried out without warning, ignoring international laws. Therefore, a new naval weapon played an essential role in naval warfare: the U-boat. In France, the year had begun with several battles in Champagne and Artois, in which the French tried to remove the Germans from their positions. The German infantry outnumbered the French, so their machine gun nests being better provided, they exacted a heavy toll on the assaulting troops. The fights, only briefly held on for reorganization tasks, went on till mid-February 1915. In March, a great French offensive was canceled on account of the heavy German counterattacks and the ensuing heavy losses. Later in that year, Champagne was the theater of another important battle. Relationship between the old Triple Alliance members kept on falling apart due to the Italian territorial ambitions. For this reason, the Austro-Hungarian government sent 30 battalions to their Italian highland borderline. The United States kept on to their neutrality, something quite pleasant for many, and particularly to the Germans, albeit their actions led the opposite way. Not only did the German submarines almost evict Great Britain from the war by way of starvation, but they also were to a great extent responsible for the involvement of the United States in 1917. Thus breeding heavy consequences for Germany. Crisis burst out between Germany and the United States when the liner Lusitania was sunk by a German U-boat on May the 7th, 1915. The week before, she was in the New York harbor getting ready for the voyage. The German embassy placed a note besides the sailing announcement warning that embarking in the Lusitania was dangerous and she was a possible war objective. The ship sailed with her cargo and passengers on board. The crew was confident that the speed of the Lusitania would allow them to leave behind any U-boat. They were wrong, and the German U-boat that was waiting for her off the Kinsale coast of Ireland launched a single torpedo that brought about a strange second explosion, sending the ship to the bottom in only 20 minutes. Almost 1,200 lives were lost, including 128 quite influential Americans. After the deed, the public opinion began to feel better disposed to the United States joining in the war, a feeling that strengthened with every wreckage. War was a stimulus for the development of military aircraft building. In France, the Baron of Tricornet founded the first fighter unit with Parasol aircrafts, while the Royal Flying enhanced its aircrafts with the latest technology to improve their reconnaissance and bombing capacities. On May 27th, French pilots on board their Voisin-type planes made their first raid against German factories of poisonous gas at Ludwigshafen. At the same time, the German high staff, satisfied with their aircraft's performances over English ground, launched by the end of May and first days of June a great air raid with 4 Zeppelins against London and the English eastern harbors. Although war in the Western Front had come to a dead halt, the Germans were not doing too bad in the East. Encouraged by their success at Tannenberg on the previous year, some commanders were dubious about the Russian capacity for recovering after the huge losses they had suffered. At the end of January 1915, the German Ninth Army, under von Mackensen, launched an attack aimed at Warsaw. The Germans started the Battle of Bolimov with more than 700 artillery pieces, sending for the first time 20,000 bombs of poisonous gas on the Russian positions. A strong wind and the acute cold disrupted this German attempt. The Russians made their counterattack on February the 6th, regaining the ground they had lost and killing 20,000 von Mackensen's troops, but losing 40,000 at it. The battle was not conclusive, but the Germans made the most of it as a diversion maneuver to hide their real intentions. The Great von Hindenburg Offensive launched all along with the Austro-Hungarian army on the very next day. Under a heavy hailstorm, the 8th and 10th German armies rushed on the 10th Russian army and pushed them about 62 miles back to the Ostogov forest, where they surrendered on February the 21st. In this clash, known as the Second Battle of the Masurian Lakes, the Germans captured 80,000 Russian prisoners. Trying to relieve the pressure on the Russians, and by their own entreaty, the British schemed a plan to defeat Turkey and supply the Tsar's armies with armament through the Black Sea harbors. The Ottoman Empire, Turkey, was at war since October the 29th, 1914, and had helped the Germans by shelling these harbors. Therefore, in the early days of November, Russia, France, and Great Britain had declared war on the Turks. The plan had been designed in the early days of the year by Winston Churchill, and its linchpin was a bold Allied attack on the Dardanelles and the Gallipoli Peninsula. It was initially conceived as purely a sea battle. The Turkish strongholds around the straits were to be pounded by British ships until surrender. It soon showed that the plan was unrealistic, for not only the naval artillery lacked the accuracy to hit the strongholds, but even assuming the shelling to be successful, the lack of infantry troops would prevent the British to seize the coast strip. Therefore, they would not be able to receive supplies. The Navy would be forced to sail back home for refueling and food supplies. However, Churchill's plan was officially approved by the War Department in the last days of January 1915. British Minister Lord Kitchener ordered an infantry division to be ready in case of a successful naval action. On February the 19th, 1915, a French-British naval assault was launched, but it failed due to the poor Allied armament and the effective Turkish defense network. Instead of halting the hostilities to reorganize the army and armament, the French and British governments stubbornly went on with the naval and landed combined assault. The whole operation was led by a freshly appointed Lord Kitchener's protege, General Sir Ian Hamilton. Hamilton was supplied with 75,000 men and 18,000 French colonial troops. They were to face 84,000 Turkish troops under the command of the German officer Liman von Sanders, that among other problems suffered from scarce ammunition. Due to their organization conundrums, von Sanders apprehended that an Allied invasion could be successful. But von Sanders ignored that Sir Hamilton was not better off in terms of operation organization. But even worse, having sailed from England with only a fraction of the assigned troops and disregarding the intelligence reports. The landings took place on the 25th of April, 1915, in 3 different points. The British landed in Cape Helles, at the head of the Gallipoli Peninsula. Australian and New Zealander troops did it north of Cape Ari Brunu, soon to be called Anzac Cove. The third landing, meant to be a diversion for the Turkish command, was carried out by the French in Kunkal, in front of the Dardanelles. The landing points were selected by Hamilton, having in mind to allow the Allied fleets dash through the straits once the troops had strengthened their bridgeheads. 35,000 men from the 29th British Division landed in Cape Helles, south of the peninsula, in 5 different spots under heavy fire from the local Turkish defenders. Way off in the Aegean coast, the Anzacs, 17,000 troops from Australia and New Zealand, were landed in Ari Burnu and Gaba Tip. At the beginning, the Turkish defenders found themselves in trouble, for they could just set one division against the Allies. In spite of this drawback, this division fought remarkably well and thwarted the drive of the 35,000 men coming up from Cape Helles. In 2 of the 5 landing places, the Turkish troops showed a strong opposition. The other 3 bridgeheads were quickly secured, although hesitation in the chain of command brought about confusion and utter loss of the first minute's advantage. The Anzacs were better off. They found no opposition to their landing and made the most of it, taking over the summits that mastered the whole peninsula. However, a stalwart Turkish force hastily gathered by Colonel Kemal checked the Anzacs' progress and eventually forced them to withdraw to the beaches by the end of the journey. The Allies' position was therefore not much encouraging by dusk. The landings had been carried out, but any progress was impossible, for they were surrounded by the Turks, posted on the hills surrounding the beachheads. Hamilton troops ran quickly out of ammunition, and they were constrained to use artillery on a permanent basis. But the Turkish troops were also unable to drive on, for they could not push back to the sea the well-entrenched Hamilton's men. This stalemate was not much more than a pitiful rendering of the Trenches War in the Western Front, and the British tried more than once to take over the town of Krithia, but in vain. They lost more than 9,000 men in these attempts for a petty gain of 2 miles. Hamilton's force had lost 50% of its soldiers, so he was compelled to ask Kitchener for reinforcements from London. He eventually agreed, but had to face a storm of blame from the French and British commanders in the Western Front, downright determined not to dispense with any of their armies. Finally, thanks to a 12-division reinforcement, Hamilton's next move was performed on August 6, 1915. It was another landing up north in the Suvla Bay, near the beach of Adi Burna. The objective was to merge the troops in Helles with those in Anzac Cove, and break the siege to meet the new landed force. Meanwhile, Turkish reinforcements kept flowing to the peninsula until they gathered 14 divisions. The offensive was to start with General Street's attack on Helles. He chose a great-scale thrust that was immediately repelled and vanished by August the 10th. This fact allowed Mustafa Kemal's troops a larger freedom of action in the north. In Anzac Cove, the attempt to seize the Sarıbayır grounds on the 6th of August was also a failure due to the command's lack of coordination and the troops' fatigue. The landing started at 10 p.m. on August the 6th, 1915. 20,000 men trampled the beach at Suvla Bay. The British troops were successful in several points of the bay, thanks to the Turkish Army reconnaissance unit's mistakes, so they just found some lone sniper to check them. Sir Frederick Stopford, commander of the Allied troops, could not sustain such a march and keep the forefront positions, so the Turks increased their numbers and took over the hills around Suvla Bay, forcing the Allies to retreat to the landing points. At the outcome of the clash, the Turkish army had lost 30,000 men for 20,000 to the Allies, and they were all bogged down in trench warfare at the Suvla, since the British attempts to link with the troops at Helles and Anzac Cove had all been a failure. Hamilton requested a 95,000 soldier reinforcement force from the British War Department, but he was refused. With pressure climbing up in France and the new plans for an attack on Thessaloniki, there was nothing available. The only choice was then to withdraw the troops as quickly as possible. Kitchener himself, after his inspection of the area and after beating about the bush for some weeks, eventually issued the order for evacuation on December the 7th, 1915. By that time, unfortunately, a heavy blizzard jeopardized the operation. Nevertheless, the evacuation of 105,000 men from Anzac Cove and Suvla Bay was successfully carried out between December the 10th and the 20th. The evacuation of the 35,000 men in Helles took place between the last days of December and January the 6th, 1916. Painstaking efforts were made to satisfy the 100,000 Turkish soldiers that the Allied troops' movements didn't mean to withdraw. The evacuation operations were to be seen as the only real success of the campaign, as they were carried out without too many losses. 480,000 Allied troops took part in the Gallipoli campaign. They suffered 252,000 losses, including 48,000 dead. The Turkish losses amounted to 250,000, including at least 65,000 dead. This disaster forced Winston Churchill to resign as First Lord of the Admiralty. In the spring of 1915, eyes turned again on the Western Front. In Neuve-Chapelle, west of Lille and north of France, the Germans held petty positions. On March the 10th, British and French troops launched an assault to wipe them out. The attack's spearhead was Douglas Haig's First Army. They started with an artillery barrage of 35 minutes on both sides of the Neuve-Chapelle, aiming at the capture of the Aubers Crest, something over a mile off the town. Lack of ammunition and the bad quality thereof prevented the 342 guns hitting the Germans all along the 2 miles front from yielding the predicted result, even if it's supported by the Recco aircrafts from the Royal Air Corps. In this operation, more shells were fired than in the whole Boer War. A good example of the changes warfare had undergone in the last 15 years. 4 divisions amounting to 40,000 men spread along the 2-mile front. Infantry was frequently engaged at close quarters, but the first steps were quick. Sir John French's British Expeditionary Force marched through a German sector only protected by 1 division from Prince Reprick's 6th Army. It took them 4 hours to secure their positions in town, a fact considered as a blatant victory. But the supply and communication problems kept on pestering Haig's troops. Ruprecht sent the reserves to Neuve-Chapelle and launched a counterattack on March the 12th. The British troops managed to hold to their conquered land, a little over 1 mile, lost in October 1914. The British troops' attempt to seize the Aubers Crest was an impossible task. From the 1,000 men that went on, not a single one survived. Meanwhile, General Pétain's troops started the Second Battle of Artois, making a fast drive to the Vimy Crest, deemed of a great strategic value. The British rerouted their effort in order to support Petain's offensive, and General Haig's First Army charged on Festubert after 3 days of an intensive barrage. German opposition, the rain, and the lack of ammunition drove them to failure. British Commander-in-Chief Sir John French put the blame on the disaster on the lack of ammunitions and remarked that Shell's production in Great Britain had been unable to satisfy the demand in what was clearly to be seen as a long war. After Lord Northcliffe's Daily Mail heavy criticisms, the British government gave life to the ammunitions department and placed it under the head of David Lloyd George. French decided that the British Expeditionary Force should be kept in store shells for the future. But prolonging the time of shelling nullified the essential surprise element, granting the Germans an extra time to get ready. After the Allied flop at Neuve-Chapelle, it was the Germans' turn to counterattack, this time in Ypres, Belgium. It was the only great German operation in the Western Front in 1915, for they were set on defeating the Russians. In fact, the main reason for their offensive was to turn the Allies' concern away from the East. On April the 13th, 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II had agreed to lead the efforts on the Eastern Front and ordered 8 divisions to be carried by train to the south of Krakow. The Second Ypres, as the offensive came to be known, is generally remembered for the fact of being the first time gas was used in the Western Front. The Germans had used it in Bolimov the same year, but its impact at Ypres was much more effective, disregarding the fact that it was a violation of the Hague Convention that forbade gas in warfare. "168 tons of chlorine were released out of 5,700 cans by dawn of the 22nd April 1915 against the French Algerians and the territorial troops after a brief shelling with 17-inch guns. A brownish-gray mist hovered from the German front line to the French positions. Panic-stricken, the Allied troops fled to Ypres, while the heavy gas sloped down into the soldier-crammed trenches. Along 4 miles of trenches, gas bore upon some 10,000 men, half of which were dead within 10 minutes, after the gas reached the front line. The cause of death was suffocation. Those who made it were temporarily blinded, flustered by confusion, and suffering from rash coughing fits. On top of that, 2,000 men were taken prisoners. 2 German Army Corps, wearing rough breathing devices, hurried on through the 7-mile gap in the Allied lines. The next day, a second gas attack was launched on Saint-Julien, where the Canadian troops were gathered. Thanks to their hastily contrived masks made of wet handkerchiefs, they succeeded in checking the German advance. But the fear of gas prevented the German troops to take full advantage of it. After gaining 2 miles and taking over the position called Hill 60, they had to stop when engaged in a hot-foot counterattack of General Smith-Dorrien's troops, proffering a withdrawal to Ypres. He felt that only a large-scale counter-offensive could drive the Germans back to their positions. This idea didn't please too well the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir John French, who ordered Smith-Dorrien to be dismissed and sent back to England. Smith-Dorrien's successor, General Herbert Plumer, also recommended a withdrawal, and this time the suggestion was accepted. The Allied command reacted swiftly to the gas tactics and remarked that it was fairly easy to protect the troops against the chlorine by providing them with masks. From then on, the German infantry suffered heavy losses in the fierce struggles that were to come. On May the 24th, 1915, a hard German assault on the Bellewaerde Hill compelled the Allies to a further retreat. But the Germans were running out of supplies and men, so they had to cancel the offensive. Instead, they shelled the old city with artillery, hoping to raze it to the ground. The German attack substantially diminished the Allies' positions. The highest ground positions had been lost, and now they only held some 20 square miles in southwestern Belgium. Losses after the Second Battle of Ypres amounted to 69,000 Allied soldiers and 35,000 Germans. This time, gas was the reason for the difference. But the use of gas in Belgium increased the strain upon the degraded relationship with the still neutral United States. From then on, both parties used gas with different results. The British used it for the first time in the Battle of Loos, starting in the early days of May, while there was still fighting up north around Ypres. It was part of a major French-British offensive in Artois. French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre and the British commanders were confident in the fact of outnumbering the Germans. Sometimes the rate was 3-1 for the French, but even thus, the assaults on Vimy near Arras were a failure. On May the 1st, 1915, a German attack was launched against the towns of Garlis and Tarnow. For over 4 hours, 700 artillery guns fired traditional and gas bombs under a heavy snowstorm. In 1 week, Germans and Austrians made 40 miles through the south flank after annihilating the Russian Third Army. On their retreat, they were pressed from the north, this time on their right flank in Galicia. Fighting in agony, the Russians finally broke the German enclosure, and many were able to flee. Nevertheless, 56,000 were lost, and just about the same number were taken prisoners. The situation in Flanders and the Western Front was untenable. But a new front was opened when Italy joined the Allies in May, pretending to break the Austrian lines and seize Trieste. The battles of the Isonzo were so called because they were carried out near the river Isonzo, now in Slovenia, in the eastern sector of the Italian front between June 1915 and November 1917. In the Great War times, this 50-mile-long river ran from north to south in Austria and along the Italian borderline through the mountains to the Adriatic Sea. The many front miles were held by the Austro-Hungarians, having predicted that Italy would join the war and therefore having carefully prepared their positions. It was a multiple-line defense system based upon machine gun crossfire. The Italian Chief of Staff, Luigi Cardona, imagined that the success of the campaign relied on an attack along the eastern coast, through the mouth of the Isonzo, although he knew this river was prone to overflow in case of heavy rains. 12 battles were fought all along the river, and all of them ended up in stalemates or disaster for the Italian army. 4 of them took place in 1915, and even though the Italians outnumbered them, the Austro-Hungarians, in their well-prepared positions, kept their ground, causing many losses to the enemy. On June the 23rd, 1915, the first Isonzo battle started with the Italian commanders making the same mistake that their Western Front colleagues. They sent the infantry on with no artillery support. After 2 weeks, the attack was canceled. On July the 18th, the Second Isonzo battle began. The Italian forces did not make the other bank, and much less did they take over the strategically important stretch of land between Bipaco and the sea and the road to Trieste. Hard rains and mud rounded up the disaster. On November the 4th, 1915, the attack was canceled. The Italian forces never kept a consistent offensive in the whole front. Losses were high: 70,000 for the Italians and 42,000 for the Austro-Hungarians. In France, on September the 25th, after 4 days of a barrage in which 2,500 guns delivered 250,000 bombs, the Second Battle of Champagne was on. It was a part of the 3 offensive launched by the Anglo-French army. In the Third Battle of Artois, a second French attack was able to take over for the 3rd time the Vimy Summit. As a part of the Great Offensive, the First Army of General Sir Douglas Haig charged between Laon and the Canal of La Bassée, and that was the beginning of the Battle of Loos. After 4 days of intensive artillery bombing, the British ran short of ammunition. Never minding that, Haig sent 6 divisions to the clash. The British enjoyed a massive superiority in numbers, but they were exhausted and the ground was difficult. When the artillery barrage stopped, Haig ordered for the first time to use the gas cans. The amount of gas was reckoned to mess up the undeveloped German masks of the time. Gas started to follow the winds. In some places, the wind sent it back to the British trenches, making more than 2,500 losses. On the first day, they covered 2 miles and partly took over the Hohenzollern stronghold, the town of Loos, and the Hill 70. The attack of the 26th was repelled by the German troops that re-seized the Hohenzollern stronghold. After several days of fight, the British were forced to withdraw. In this battle, Rudyard Kipling's son, John, was killed. Kipling was a Nobel Prize laureate and author of the universally known novels such as The Jungle Book or Kim. When the news reached him, he set off for France with his wife in an attempt to find their son's body and bury him. His affliction was only good enough to openly display the agony that thousands of fathers were undergoing all over the world. The British resumed their attack on Loos the 13th of October. They reconquered the Hohenzollern stronghold and were able to successfully repel the German counterattacks. In this battle, the British lost 50,000 men and the Germans only half that number, about 26,000. The British flop in Loos led to John French's dismissal as Commander-in-Chief, his charge being assumed by Douglas Haig in the last days of 1915. On the other hand, the French success in Champagne was limited, in spite of a swell beginning. The use of new weapons kept both sides on a technical stalemate. The Kaiser's soldiers were very well entrenched in their concrete-hardened machine gun redoubts. More than often, the artillery broadsides fell harmlessly on the barbed wire land in front of the German trenches. Even if perchance the assault troops succeeded in getting through the barbed wire, they soon found out that the artillery had no perceivable effect on the deep bunkers. The Germans used sensitively their reserves. They placed the minimal possible defense in a sector, keeping a larger amount of men in the second line, out of the artillery's reach. When the artillery broadsides were at an end, these forces charged in counterattack. These tactics were often successful because the number of attacking troops had been lowered by machine gun fire. (1915) ended with the Allied withdrawal from Gallipoli. In a way, this campaign was the brand of the Second War Year. Small victories for huge costs in lives. By the finishing year, the French general, Joseph Joffre, and Sir Douglas Haig had a meeting in order to plan a great counterattack operation in the River Somme sector of the Western Front to be carried out in the early days of 1916. Prospects were of a new year of hardships and many killings.